Hi guys, I'm Kristen. This is Kristen is Fully Booked. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I've been reading recently. So once again, I'm in this temporary setup, and again, the room is a little bit echoey, and that's because I just moved. We don't have very much furniture. It is what it is. Here we are. But today, obviously, I'm going to talk about the books that I read recently, what I'm currently reading, and what I have coming up next. When I left you last, the last book that I had read was Assassin's Quest, and after that I read The Voyage of the Basilisk, which was an audiobook that I listened to for my Memoirs of Lady Trent read-along that I'm doing with a couple other channels. You are of course welcome to check out the live that we did where we talked about that book. It is over on Sarah's channel on Bright and Bookish. You can check that out. I think we had a pretty great discussion. I feel like a little bit of the shine is wearing off of this series as we really delve into it and go through like nitty-gritty details of different various representations or how the author chooses to handle certain topics. And I think on this one it was kind of split. There was 3 out of the 5 of us thought that it was rather boring or a little bit boring, and that included myself, whereas 2 of the other hosts thought that this was a really great book because it did focus so much more on dragons and like specifically the taxonomy of dragons and dragon related species like sea serpents and various like fire lizards and stuff like that. I think this one was probably my least favorite in the series so far. I just felt like Lady Trent herself wasn't even as charming or interesting as she had been in the past couple books, and she did some definitely questionable things, or at least the author chose to put our character in a pretty questionable situation for an unclear purpose, and to be honest, I felt like it had no plot significance whatsoever. So I'm not even sure why she did it in the half-hearted way that she did that. If you've read the series, you know what I'm talking about. I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't yet though. The next book that I finished was The Black Coast by Mike Brooks, and this is the first book in the God King Chronicles, which is one of my priority series for the year. So check off another box for another priority series started for me. I was really nervous to read The Black Coast because it was one of Maria's favorite books from last year, or maybe possibly her favorite book from last year. I did really like it, but there was something that like undefinable, something that just prevented this book from being not a favorite for me. And I honestly couldn't even say what it was, but I am jumping the gun. So let me tell you about this book. This is the one where the 2 cultures who have historically raided, or one has historically raided, the other one hasn't in 15 years or so. And this time when the sails show up on the horizon, the raiders, or the people who used to be raiders, are actually seeking refuge. Everyone who talks about this book mentions that it really focuses on the culture clash between the 2 cultures, but I will say that is definitely the case. But what was different in my expectations from what the book was actually like was that it was really the 2 sort of leaders of these 2 groups of people talking about the culture clash. We didn't often get to see the problems as they arose in the situation, other than one circumstance, but usually it was that something would happen and the 2 chiefs would meet and they would talk about, or like the chief and the lord would meet and they would talk about what happened. And it was only really through their eyes and through their reactions to things that we got to see a lot of the cultural clash happening. I don't know that that was necessarily a good or bad thing. It was just something that I wasn't expected, and that made me feel less like I was really seeing the 2 cultures having trouble merging. We get both perspectives of the chief of the kind of raiding culture that felt very reminiscent of Vikings. I won't call them Vikings, but they felt Scandinavian in a lot of their culture components. And then we also get the point of view of the lord of the place where they go to land. And then we do get a couple other perspectives, but those definitely felt like very minor plot points that are going to become more significant in later books. I think there was just something a little bit slower to the pace, as I said, just with the fact that it was really focusing in on the chief and the lord tensions and their reactions to events happening, that made it feel like it wasn't as amazing for me personally, or as great of an experience as I was expecting for this book. Now, I don't do keywords for sequels, so that's why I didn't have any for The Voyage of the Basilisk, but I will share the keywords for The Black Coast, which were culture clash, slow pace, character focus, age gap, honor system, and language. Do with those what you will. I am planning to read the second book, The Splintered King, in May because the 3rd and final book in this trilogy is coming out in June. So I don't have plans to pick that up immediately, but I'm hoping to get to it at least towards the end of May or early June so that I can read the 3rd and final book in June when it comes out. Next up, I read Hook, Line and Sinker by Tessa Bailey. I listened to this as the audiobook. It was sort of my last day of packing, and I just needed something that didn't require a lot of brain power and focus to follow along with, but also something that kept me distracted from being stressed and overwhelmed. So this was a great book for that. Hook, Line, and Sinker is the companion novel to It Happened One Summer, which came out last year, which I read last year and absolutely loved. It is following the sister of the main character and the best friend of the male lead from that other book. We do get both Hannah's perspective and Fox's perspective. The book takes place a few months after the events of the first book, and it begins with a prologue where the two of them are maintaining a text-based friendship over the intervening months. It was really, really adorable to see them connecting in that way. I had seen some kind of middling reviews on this book, but personally, I really, really liked it. This is a romance book where the communication between the two people is actually really great. There were times when you would almost see like a miscommunication was about to happen, and instead they would choose to be open and honest with the other person. That was really great to watch. The setup here is described as that Hannah comes back to this small town where Fox and her sister and her now almost brother-in-law live, and she stays with Fox for a couple weeks for a work project, but she has a huge crush on her boss, and Fox is sort of giving her tips on how to pick this guy up. And I will say that that is really only a thing for the first 25%, even less. It doesn't feel like that's the focus of this book. It feels a lot more like Fox and Hannah trying to figure out if they can be together based on their own hang-ups. Like, really the only reason that they're not together is because Fox has a little bit of a hang-up on himself because everyone in his life views him as this big player who can't commit, can't settle down, or who won't settle down. And Fox allows the views of other people to change and impact his view of himself and his ability to be anything different. This is a companion novel, and in a lot of romance companion series, it's not always necessary to read the books or to read them in a certain order, but I will say that's not the case in this one. I think that you do have to read It Happened One Summer in order to read Hook, Line, and Sinker. I did type up a full review for this book on Goodreads, so if you'd like to check that out, check out my Goodreads link down below and you can find that review and see what I thought in full detail. But overall, I did really like this. It did have a slightly different feel to It Happened One Summer, but similar to It Happened One Summer, it was more about just like, can these two people be together? Not any particular trope. Although this one, it was quasi friends to lovers, I would say. For keywords here, I just put open communication, friends to lovers, and big city meets small town. The next two books that I read were new releases that came out on May 3rd, and this is Book Lovers by Emily Henry and Book of Night, which I'm also just realizing they both are like book themed, by Holly Black. They both came out on May 3rd, and I happened to check my Overdrive app at exactly the right time when both of these books were uploaded to my library. So I was able to take them out from the library right away and not just get put on a waiting list, which never happens to me with new releases, but that also means that I now have figured out exactly when my library uploads new books. Really, really great for the future. I'm looking forward to taking advantage of that. Or at least I'm hoping that it is a consistent thing that happens at that library at that exact time. But anyway, the next book that I read then was Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This was an anticipated release for me, but it is one that I went into knowing absolutely nothing. I didn't want to know anything about this book going into it. I don't know if that worked out for me. I did not really, really love this book, actually. I wouldn't say that it was as far as a disappointment because I had almost no expectations because, again, I went in knowing nothing. I just know that I like Emily Henry's writing, and her writing is really good. I liked the writing of this book, but I did not like a lot of the other things about this book. This book was sort of a take on a Hallmark movie. It wasn't described using those words, but it had big city guy goes to a small town on behalf of an evil corporation to try to do something and falls for small town girl, despite the fact that he has this horrible, cruel, evil, cold girlfriend back home. And what it did with this book in the prologue is that it set up the book as if, like, here's this, you know, this familiar storyline. Well, I'm the villain. I'm the cold-hearted corporate girlfriend back home who everyone hates. I thought this was genius. I thought this was hilarious, and I really liked that we were going to get the viewpoint of someone who is a little bit more career-focused, a little bit colder. There is also a scene in the prologue where she meets with an editor, and they have a lot of snark and tension and don't really seem to care for each other at all. You are going to see this book described as enemies to lovers or hate to love by other readers. And I am here to definitively say This book is not hate to love. It's not enemies to lovers. The tagline for this book was two rivals, one summer, and that tagline is wrong. Yes, the two people have one bad interaction at the beginning, and the book itself takes place like a couple years after that event, and they're not close, but they're also not enemies, they're not rivals, they don't hate each other, they just don't really like each other. The book itself follows Nora and her sister who go on a sister getaway to a very small town. And here she runs into none other than the editor, I'm forgetting his name, Charlie, that she had that unfortunate run-in with in the prologue. And so the little bit of a twist here is that it's like big city, cold corporate job person goes to small town and doesn't fall for small town guy, even though her sister keeps trying to push her into a small town guy. She instead goes and meets someone also from the big city who is also really into his job, and the two of them obviously have a thing. Unfortunately, because we're trying to do a twist on that Hallmark movie setup, it read a little bit too closely to that Hallmark movie setup, which I absolutely hate. So there was just too many similarities and parallels to that trope for me to really, really enjoy everything that existed around the actual relationship. But I really liked Nora and Charlie together. I thought they had great tension, I thought they had great chemistry, I thought they had great dialogue and banter. But everything else around them, the setting, the plot, the sister, I really just either really hated or didn't care about. I really, really disliked the sister, and it was clear that the sister was like keeping a secret, something was up. I just kind of spent the whole time waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I was convinced it was going to be something in particular, and it wasn't, and even what it was kind of a bit of a letdown. Part of me wants to say that this book almost felt like Emily Henry liked. Like it wasn't as gritty and dramatic or emotional as her other books have been. There was a part towards the end when our main character was sort of like dealing with her emotions that I did feel a little bit teary, but the whole book overall felt significantly less or lighter than her other books in a way that I wasn't expecting. I do still really love the writing. I love Emily Henry's writing in this book. I love the relationship and the banter, but everything else around it was not for me. And so I wound up feeling pretty disappointed about this book overall. I do have the keywords here for you. They were Hallmark movie, sisterhood, loss of a parent, career romance, big city meets small town. And then the other new release that I read, because I was just on a roll with these new releases, was Holly Black's Book of Night. Now this was Holly Black's adult fantasy debut. I did do a full review of this, so you can check that out. It was a big miss for me. I went into this book with very little expectation because I thought that the synopsis was very vague and I didn't really have a sense of anything that was going to happen in the book other than that I thought it was going to be dark and gritty and atmospheric, because Holly Black can usually write a good kind of edgy, slightly disturbing, dark book. And this was not that. This felt a lot like it was trying to be dark, but there was so little atmospheric tension to the book that nothing really hit. Because the synopsis that is provided is so vague, I will try to provide an alternative one here for you. So this follows Charlie, who in fact lives in our world. I think that is an important thing to note that was not provided. But anyway, this follows Charlie, who is in her late 20s. She used to be a con artist. She lives in Massachusetts, and it is our world, but a little bit in the future. Nothing is different other than the fact that there are shadows that kind of come to life, or that quicken, I think was the word that was used, where if you are someone who has a quickened shadow, you can then do magic with the shadow. Charlie is a bartender. She used to be a con artist, but she's trying to get away from that world. She describes herself as someone who always will make the wrong choice. And one night when walking home from work, she sort of witnesses a murder. She doesn't actually see the murder happen, but she sees the result of the murder, body and someone there. And because Charlie always makes bad decisions, she decides to look into what happened and what went down there, which makes her a huge suspect and person of interest, not to the cops, but to the other people who have to deal with the murder of that guy. The romance plays into it a little bit, but it's not a huge priority. In fact, like a good chunk in the middle of the book, it is not really at play whatsoever. So don't go into this book looking for Jude and Carden, which I had heard before. That was one of the things I heard about this going into it. Don't go into it looking for adult Jude and Carden. That's not what it is. As I said before, you can check out my review that has full details, but really I just felt like this book kind of fell flat. It was supposed to sort of have a little bit of a mystery, but it wasn't a page-turning mystery. There was something about the writing that was just so flat and a little bit boring that there was not that dark sense of like, this is supposed to be this like mysterious secret societies, billionaires with secrets, dirty underbelly of a world. And just the writing did not really support any of that vibe somehow, despite pieces of those things all being there. I kept waiting for that feeling of atmosphere to happen and it just never came. Let me get the keywords here for you. I put down con artist, modern setting, shadow magic, fade to black, no atmosphere, and no tension. And then continuing on with more new releases, I read Sarah Tomi's All the Horses of Iceland. This is a historical fantasy novella that tells a imagined story of how horses came to be in Iceland. I did get an e-arc for this and I tried reading it earlier this winter, but it just wasn't working for me. The writing was not as beautiful and whimsical and lyrical as I was expecting, but I decided to pick it back up and try again. So I successfully finished this novella. I did end up liking it more than I thought I was going to when I first put it down, but it really didn't have the storyline or the feeling that I thought it was going to. Based on some of the reviews that I had seen, I thought this was going to be so beautiful and I thought it was going to be whimsical and I thought it was going to be this like magical story of a horse like origin story. And really what it is following this one character, Ivan, who is Icelandic, and he is a trader, and he goes trader with a D, not traitor. He is a trader and he winds up getting into this like group of merchants who travel far to the southeast. The author did use some historical terms, and I am not a historian, so I was not actually certain of all of the places that they went. Suffice to say, I don't know where this took place, but I'm sure that you could look that up. But we follow Ivan's journey as he goes to this place, as he deals with this curse, and as he takes certain horses back to Iceland. I did enjoy the second half of the book a lot more than the first book, just because there was sort of like the connection to that horse was going on, not anywhere near as like connection to a horse as like Solovai in the Bear and the Nightingale or in the Winter Night trilogy. But the horse was involved in the latter half, and that was really interesting to see at least. But it was such a quick story, and there were historical references to things that I just didn't think were necessary from like a viewpoint thing. Like there's a viewpoint or a comment about albinism and a comment about physical disabilities, and they didn't actually play any role, so I didn't see why they had to be there. The writing was actually pretty flat and like very bare minimum, that it didn't really create a lot of atmosphere either. So it wasn't exactly the experience that I was expecting to have. And because of that, it was a little bit of a disappointment, but I did not find it as boring as I was afraid that I was going to find it when I first put it down earlier in the year. Keywords here, I just put down historical fantasy, traveling, journey, ghosts, religion, novella. Okay, that is what I have been reading. What I currently am reading is Jade War. Still, this is an audiobook. I think I'm a little bit over halfway, but not much. And what I'm finding is just that this is the one that is a lot more geopolitical, and because it's the audiobook, even though I heard the audiobook was really good, and it is, but because it is so distant and it's so much is focused on these various countries and the political tension and like the maneuverings and political situation between all of these various countries, that I'm having trouble following along because I have no visual representation of like where all of these countries piece together. So because of that, it's just a little bit of a slower read. I do have a library copy of the like ebook as well. So I might switch to the ebook because I am going through this so slowly, just because it's not an audiobook that I can listen to and do anything else. I kind of have to like sit and listen and like piece together the countries that they're talking about and the political ramifications of certain things. So that is going slowly. I might switch to the ebook. I'm also reading Engines of Empire, which is another new release, but I'm not very far in. I'm only on the first chapter. And then another book that I have technically picked up, but I'm not very far in, is The Discord of Gods by Jen Lyons. This is the fifth and final book in A Chorus of Dragons series. With The Discord of Gods, I mentioned in the last book that I had a copy of the ebook and that I wanted to get a copy of the audio because I wanted to immersion read that. And what I discovered is that the audio is available on Scribd. So I'm hoping to immersion read that. When I started out, it was a little bit confusing actually. So I think what I might do is go back and listen to the last couple chapters of The House of Always, the 4th book, just to get a little bit of context of where we are, because I think that where we started this book out, it was somewhere else, and I just don't remember why they're doing all of the things that they're doing at the beginning. So I'm gonna go back and listen to just a couple chapters for context, and then jump into this. I'm very nervous. I feel like I want it to be an amazing ending, and I'm just really nervous about it. Because I read so many new releases recently, I'm kind of thinking about continuing to focus on new releases going into May. So that would include both the Discord of Gods and Engines of Empire. And then I do have a couple e-arcs on NetGalley that I haven't read yet that I'm losing time on. So I also might focus on those books next, which is what is coming up next, obviously. So I have an e-arc copy of the first binding by R.R. Virdi, which is a here let me tell you my story kind of a setup. So I only have so many days left to read that, and I think it is pretty big and chunky. I have started to see some reviews coming out for that lately, and people are feeling pretty good about it. So I'm looking forward to getting into that book. It was one of my anticipated releases for the year. And then another e-arc that I have that I think I need to read somewhat soon is A Mirror Mended by Alex E. Harrow, which is the second book in the Fractured Fairy Tales, I think that is what that's called, but it's the follow-up to Spindle Splintered that I read last year. And these are like modern feminist retellings of certain fairy tales. The first one was Sleeping Beauty. I think this one is Snow White, and I think it's focusing on the evil queen. So I will get to that one shortly as well. But other than that, I don't want to say too much of like what's coming up next, because I just started Discord of Gods and Engines of Empire. And of course, obviously at some point in May, I have to read In the Labyrinth of Drakes by Marie Brennan. So that is it. That is what I have read, what I'm reading, and what is coming up next. Let me know what you have read recently or what is next up on your TBR, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a great day. Bye.